Space, like language, is socially constructed, and like the syntax of language, the spatial arrangements of our buildings and communities reflect and reinforce the nature of gender, race, and class relations in society, argues Leslie Weissman. Sometimes this is manifested by spatially separating female and male activities, such as the creation of separate dressing rooms, bathing facilities, or restrooms of each sex. One social construct that is sometimes overlooked in the study of sacred architecture involves how the binary system of gender, the feminine or masculine, is mapped or encoded in built form. Male and female symbols have manifested themselves in religious traditions in various ways across time. But as one considers the Christian tradition, one might ask, why is a bride placed on the left side of a church and the groom opposite on the right? Where did this placement originate, and what does it mean? One of the ways that the social construct of gender, how it manifests itself in sacred architecture, is clearly demarcated spatial hierarchies, seating arrangements, architectural devices, iconographic configurations, and liturgical requirements. This has been defined by our very own Tammy Gaber as gendered spaces. This suggests that the profane and secular socioeconomic constructs of society are mirrored in the sacred and holy spaces that religious traditions have built over the ages. One might wonder if a gendered space, therefore, can actually still be considered sacred. Some commentators contest that most, if not all, sacred space is socially constructed. Others argue that sacred space is qualitatively different than that found in society, since it is where the profane world is transcended. Several scholars approaching gendered space from a feminist lens have placed special emphasis on the discriminatory and misogynist messages derived from patriarchal dominion. Analytical approaches from feminism have provided great insights into social-cultural issues. However, they do not always provide adequate historical interpretations. Consequently, I propose a reassessment to some of the existing academic interpretations associated with Christian gendered sacred space. This requires approaching the topic with what C.W. Westphal calls pious skepticism, or what Lindsay Jones refers to as a skeptical-minded hermeneutic of suspicion. In short, it can be described as a fundamentally skeptical approach to the inherited tradition, while assuming the possibility of some value being found there. With this backdrop in mind, this paper seeks to explore the social construct of gendered sacred space for the Christian tradition and its multivalent perspectives that have lasted nearly 1,700 years by looking at 4 periods of Christian history. In particular, the paper advances a claim to improve the underappreciated understanding that gender separation in sacred architecture was not always a demeaning practice, but one that celebrated the complementary nature of men and women. So let us begin by looking at the sculptural frame for the West Tympanum on York Minster Cathedral. In the biblical tradition, God created man and woman. Here, Adam is held in God's right hand. Eve is found in his left. The notion of left and right is abundant in artistic depictions of the expulsion and tree of knowledge scenes from the Garden of Eden. The symbolism of the Garden of Eden and the primordial couple's expulsion was later reflected in the sacred spaces of Judaism. In fact, some Hebrew words for south often denote the right hand, and vice versa for north. So if we conceptualize kind of an anthropomorphic ideal that God dwelled in the Holy of Holies, this makes sense of the right hand being on the south and the left on the north. Rabbinical texts further explore this symbolism of the furnishings of the Mosaic tabernacle as the tree of knowledge with the table of shewbread, and the menorah as a stylized tree of life, this notion of left and right. But there's been a long tradition of gendering spaces within Christian buildings through spatial means that relate back to the body. Each sex typically had its place within the binary order of the church, such as the left or right, north or south, and along its longitudinal axis. The male-female spatial divide has been used to convey a number of messages over time. Some interpreters suggest the practice has denigrated women, while others argue that it exalts them as the more pure and noble sex. But let's start by examining several case studies and texts. Several theological arguments from the early Christian church patriarchs and fathers suggest that gender separation was needed to maintain moral order. One of the earliest Christian depictions of Adam and Eve may reveal part of the origin of the longitudinal organization of gender. In the house church at Dura Europos, the baptistry featured a depiction of the Good Shepherd and Adam and Eve. From the building's orientation, Adam is located on the south and Eve on the north. Adam is on the right hand of the tree and Eve is on the left. Interestingly, one observes that both sexes are located on the right hand of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century explained that each level of Noah's Ark was systematically subdivided across gender lines with stakes or wooden beams to separate each gender from one another to prevent intercourse. The rationale behind this was to maintain the sake of decency and purity. In the 4th century, St. Cyril of Jerusalem compared the spatial arrangements of his church to the order found in Noah's Ark. Once the door of the church was shut, like the ark, he said, "Let there be a separation, men with men and women with women, lest the pretext of salvation become an occasion of destruction. But if you need to sit next to each other, let passions be put away." According to historian Eusebius, the architectural means of separating men and women in Constantine's Basilica at Jerusalem, where Cyril delivered his lectures, is likely the 2 porticos or side aisles on either side of the nave. In the 4th century, Archbishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, felt strongly that men were not only distracted by the beauty of women during worship, but that they were suspect of entertaining unchaste thoughts and risked committing adultery in their minds. Of course, merely looking upon a woman, Jesus taught, could be considered adultery. But he argues these types of men, it would be better if they were blind than abuse their eyes. Because these men were inept to build an inward wall to separate themselves from the women, they have to use physical partitions and boards to wall them off. So from his perspective, physical partitions and boards needed to be erected to separate the sexes to prevent the church from becoming a brothel. Or it aimed at promoting sexual purity, chastity, and moral order. So based on the arguments of the early fathers, architectural developments continued through the ages to create gendered spatial divisions in the church. In the Pola casket from the 5th century, we're given a glimpse of the gender separation that took place in Old St. Peter's in Rome. Women are placed on the north and men are located on the south. This gender spatial configuration is confirmed in various records and inscriptions about the placement of each sex within the basilica. But the apse mosaic in Old St. Peter's provides yet another interesting perspective. St. Peter, who was the great rock of the church and a personification, as well as a personification of the mother church, is depicted on Jesus' left hand, where women were placed in the church. On the south side, however, men face St. Paul and the Pope. This suggests an interesting complementary composition. But in rebuilding the Catholic shrine in Kildare, Ireland, dedicated to St. Bridget around the 7th century, the monk Cogitosus notes that various entrances and partitions were used to separate the sexes. This, he says, was so that in one large basilica, a great mass of people of varying status, rank, sex, and provenance, and separated by partitions, are able to pray with a single spirit, though different in status, to the Almighty Lord. Similarly, the 6th century Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna reflected gender separation through its iconographic program. When facing the altar, one observes that the right wall shows the enthroned Christ and a group of male saints in procession towards him. The left wall shows the Virgin with the child and a group of female saints in procession towards her. Bishop Agnes of Ravenna noted that the male martyrs were on the same side of the church as the men, and vice versa for the women. Some scholars have claimed that these mosaics provide permanent gender labels and evidence of gender separation during the celebration of the liturgy. Gazing up at the opposite side of the nave, each gender would have been able to define itself against the other. After several centuries of practicing gendered sacred space, the Middle Ages brought new interpretations. The 12th century monk Honorus Augustinius proposed that the gospel be read with the deacon standing in front of the women on the north side, which was characterized by the things of the flesh, in order to call them to a life of the spirit. But other medieval theologians made more dramatic associations to the north, where women sat, as the location that represented the devil with whom the gospel was in conflict. In the 13th century, French bishop William Durandus of Mende published a liturgical treatise on the symbolism of church architecture and ritual. He advocated that men and women sit apart. For Durandus, placing men on the south signified that they were the stronger sex, ready to stand against the greater temptation. Durandus's rationale for gendered spatial divisions begins to maybe make sense if we look at the tympanum of the Last Judgment at the Church of Saint Foy in Conques, France. Because on the north, one finds the righteous on the right hand of God. Meanwhile, on the left side, one observes the damned who are thrust down to hell. With the church's orientation, the western entry tympanum provides an interesting backdrop to compare with his interpretation. Indeed, men may have been referred to as the greater sex because they're faced with the jaws of hell, but women are found at the gates of heaven on Jesus' right hand. In the apse mosaic located in the Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere, Mary, the mother of the Lord, is embraced by Christ after ascending into heaven and being crowned as the Virgin Queen of Heaven. Since the church entry opens to the east, early records reveal that women were actually placed on the north side and faced Christ. Men, on the other hand, stood and faced the Queen of Heaven. This reversal was also visible in the Papal Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. And once again, Mary in this instance is not just seen as mother, but as Mother Church, bride of her Son. While the interpretations of the Middle Ages reveal a slight shift in the orientation of gender and space, the Renaissance and Reformation clarified the importance of women on the right hand of God. As individuals from the Renaissance began viewing the cruciform of the church quite literally as Jesus on the cross, the symbolism of gender spatial mapping was turned on its head. Although women's side of the church was traditionally to the north or the left, as one approached the altar, it was reversed when considering God's perspective. She was now on the right, favored hand of God, and men were placed on his left hand. So all of this symbolism is embodied clearly in the 15th century painting by Hans von Turban of the Crucifixion, where you find the repentant thief on Jesus' right hand and the impenitent on his left. Of course, the faithful women are found at Jesus' right hand, and the male accusers are on his left. But when we think of the Renaissance, our minds are usually taken to the city of Florence as the heart of humanistic thought. From a 15th century woodcut depicting the sermon of Girolamo Savonarola, given within the Duomo in Florence, we understand that the sexes were separated by a curtain-like partition, with men on the right and women on the left. Records from Siena, Italy also reveal that the canvas partition was used in 1427 during the popular sermons of San Bernardino to separate gender during large gatherings in public squares. This is confirmed in several paintings where Bernardino is depicted preaching to a segregated congregation in the Piazza del Campo. One observes the traditional placement of women on the left and men on the right, separated by a canvas partition. But in another painting, a similar canvas partition is used to separate the sexes in the piazza in front of the Duomo in Siena. Following the traditional gendered placement, women are on the left and men are on the right. But what is revealing is that in this painting is how women are gathered at the north door of the Duomo and men are in front of the central and southern doors. It is as if those spatial requirements of the church flooded out into the public realm. The separation of the sexes was focused on maintaining moral order. But San Bernardino also noticed that several women were caught giving seductive gestures to the men. And he said, "You have turned the church into a brothel with your behavior and with your darts and grimaces. There are some women so bold and shameless that they trifle with young men even inside the church. Shame upon you, shame. You would do better to stay at home," he says. But during the 16th century, as the English Reformation was underway, separating the sexes was still a common practice. Only 15 years after King Henry separated ties with Rome, his son King Edward ordered that gender segregation remain a practice during communion in the First Book of Common Prayer in 1549. In 1576, Gian Battista Casali records the means of enforcing gender separation in Milan, and saying that in the Duomo there was a large partition, 15 feet tall, that separated, with the men on the bishop's side and the women on the Madonna side. But a year later, in 1577, Carlo Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan, published a book where he insisted on reinstating this ancient custom of separating women from men. His proposal to solve the issue involved setting up a wooden partition in the middle of the nave. But he also proposed a minimum of 3 entrances to the nave, so that you would have separate doorways reserved for men and women. So in conclusion, value, perhaps, is derived by the varied perspectives gained through hermeneutical exercises, since they paint for us a broader, often underappreciated historical interpretation of continuity. These arise from discussing several theological arguments for separating the sexes during worship and how their implementation has occurred throughout Christian history. But the examples in this paper demonstrate that sacred space was not always a demeaning practice towards women. Instead, many of the theological arguments suggest that it was a practice that celebrated the complementary nature of man and woman, the masculine and feminine. The purpose of separating the sexes was focused on maintaining holiness and order, instead of inflicting oppressive injustice or discrimination. But more often than not, women were viewed as the greater sex. Men, are you surprised? In fact, elimination of sexual distractions in worship space was the purpose of these physical divisions. But obviously, from God's perspective, women were on the chosen, blessed right hand, and men were on the condemning left hand. So, although my research is focused largely on the available resources, albeit from male interpretations, it appears that the underlying message across time is not necessarily one of discrimination towards women. Instead, it is more of a reverential message that women are the more pious sex. Christian gendered sacred space was attempting to maintain moral order. As Mary Douglas explains, holiness means keeping distinct the categories of creation. Perhaps when viewing gendered sacred spaces in this light, male and female spaces can transform and transcend the profane world and retain their holiness by transforming two things into one spiritual union. As Paul argued long ago, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. For neither is the man without the woman, neither the woman without the man in the Lord. This hermeneutical message towards women and men is much more complex than some scholars have supposed. And as such, gendered separation in Christian sacred architecture was not always a demeaning practice, but one that celebrated the complementary spiritual nature of men and women. Thank you.